Welcome back. Over the centuries, the mystery of vampires has been a constant myth. There are those who believe in it, and there are those who also doubt that vampires were ever real. Video games have been made about it, some of which I have personally enjoyed. We've had the cinema also biting in with several movies and series and TV shows. There have been documentaries trying to prove that vampires actually existed, and there are also documentaries trying to counter the claim that vampires existed, thus trying to disprove that vampires actually existed. My question for you is, yes, you, listening and watching to this video, do you actually believe in vampires? Do you believe they existed and still exist? Or you are one of those people who think that vampires are just a myth used to scare kids and to also dress up as during Halloween? If you do, well, then this case is just for you. This is the true crime story of the Argentine serial killer called the Argentine Vampire or the Window Vampire, and his real name was Florencio Roque Fernandez. He lived between 1935 to 1968, and how he went about his serial killings will shock you. If you are ready for this ride, buckle up and let's go. Florencio Fernandez, also known as the Argentine Vampire, is so crazy. The story is just so crazy and damning and so twisted that his actual existence is even disputed by some people and rather referred to as an urban legend because the story is just too odd, weird, and strange to believe. But according to other credible sources, Florencio Roque Fernandez, aka the Argentine serial killer, murdered about 15 women in total, and he did this in the hometown of Monteros, Tucumán, or Monteros in the Tucumán province in the early 1950s. And he got his name the Argentine Vampire or the Window Vampire due to how he went about his serial murders. But before we get to why or how he did what he was doing, let's first get to know a bit about him. Maybe it can help us to understand why he did what he did. So, a bit of a background about Florencio. Florencio was deemed mentally ill, and it seems he was suffering from delusions and hallucinations. And medically, this would be confirmed at a point, and these delusions and hallucinations ended up making him firmly believe that he was actually a vampire. And it's also suspected that he might possibly have been schizophrenic. And also, in addition to all this, he had a sexual attraction to blood. This is a lethal combination of just weird absurdity and crazy, culminating into a young man who was vicious and sexually attracted to the sight of blood. From a young age, he began living in the streets because his family abandoned him, and in the 1950s, his condition would be seen as very odd, most likely because science hadn't evolved to this stage or the stage it is these days, where such diagnosis can be treated in a more decent, in quotes, decent manner, where people suffering from this are not neglected by families, but rather have institutions ready to cater for them and help them, and families also ready to support them with love and whatever they can churn out to support. But unfortunately for Florencio, during his time in 1950, all these things were not readily available. So in the end, he was abandoned by his family. And as such, he began to live in the streets. Now, at the time of his arrest, Florencio was actually living in a cave adjacent to his community, and he was suffering from photophobia. For those of you who might be wondering what photophobia is, I'll just give you a bit of it and then we come back to the true crime story. So, per science, photophobia is simply a medical symptom of abnormal intolerance to visual perception of light. As a medical symptom, photophobia is not a morbid fear or phobia, but rather an experience of discomfort or pain to the eyes due to light exposure or by presence of actual physical sensitivity of the eyes, though the term is sometimes additionally applied to abnormal or irrational fear of light, such as heliophobia. The term photophobia actually just comes from the Greek word phos, meaning light, and phobos, meaning fear. Now, with this understanding in play, we begin to get insight to what had formed the foundation of the chaos that was brewing in Florencio's mind and how he was going to now unleash this, because it had set him up to become a danger to his community, so much so they had even shunned him, and he, also knowing he had been shunned, had distanced himself. But as the days grew and as the years went by, he would evolve into something else, because he actually believed, due to his medical situations, that he was actually a vampire, and over time he started behaving like a vampire. So this was what he did. Florencio, per reports, stalked his victims for several days, and his victims were all women. It's unclear why he chose women, but I think vampires' history are known to, especially the male ones, are known to be drawn to attacking women. I don't know if that's what drove him or just because he was a man and he felt the women or the females would be easier prey. But he would stalk his female victims for several days, and he would make sure that she was alone at home, nobody there but just the female victim. And then he was also really active and rampant during the spring or summer nights where there was heat even at night, and residents at the time in the 1950s would usually leave their windows open during the night to allow enough air to come in so that at least they could have a good sleep. That was the time Florencio would strike. So he would climb in through their windows and then gain access into their houses. Hence, the term or the title, the window vampire. Now we know where the window came from. Let's get to where the vampire tag will also come in. And upon gaining entrance into the house, whilst his victim slept, Florencio would then begin to beat her up. He would go on to bite her neck just like a vampire would. And sometimes he would reach deep into his teeth, with his teeth into her neck, trying to dissect the trachea and the carotid with his teeth, just like a vampire would do. And so this was in semblance to how vampires have been reported to actually suck blood and drain blood from their victims through the neck. Hence, he being tagged a vampire, an Argentine vampire for that matter, because he was Argentine, and the window vampire also because he comes in through the window. So, do you now believe he was actually a vampire, or it was a coincidence? I think there's more to this, but because of the time it occurred, there wasn't much for us to use to gather information at the time to ascertain who or what this guy really was. And after doing this, he would finally leave the victim to bleed to death. If the victim had not died already, he was known for killing and making sure that the victim is actually dead before he would leave. One of the popular women that he killed at the time was one lady called Camila Monreal of Mexico. So you see what Florencio was about. And with this modus operandi, he would go on to kill over 15 women in total before his arrest. Now, Florencio was arrested on Valentine's Day, 14th of February 1960, at the age of just 25 years, and at that time he had already killed 15 women. The press at the time described the police investigation as picturesque since it took place in the cave where Florencio lived. So this was so odd. The guy was actually living in a cave. He was behaving like a vampire because in his mind, he was actually a vampire. And he even killed and fed like a vampire. Also living in obscurity in his cave just like a vampire would. Florencio did not resist arrest. And he just complied with the police until the police brought him out of the cave and into the sunlight. So then you would begin to understand the linkage of the medical condition to his attitude. Because in the cave, definitely it's dark, so it suits him, the medical condition he was alleged to be suffering from. But at the point of coming into the sunlight, the medical condition will be triggered. Later on, Florencio was declared insane and confined to a psychiatric institution where he eventually died of natural causes a few years later. This ends the story of the Argentine vampire or the window vampire. Do you believe that vampires exist? I think this guy could have been one, or may have been a resemblance to one, or maybe somebody just evolving to become one. I don't know. But looking at how this guy operated and moved, if science says it's because of a medical condition, I don't doubt it. But I believe that since we don't actually know exactly how vampires behave, this guy could have actually been something sort of like a vampire. This is because it's already a myth. We don't know whether vampires were actually real or not. If they were real, we don't know what causes somebody to become a vampire, since the myth actually says somebody or people are not born vampires, they could be actually turned into vampires. So we don't know anything about what could make somebody a vampire, whether a vampire is born at birth or whatever. This guy could easily have been something in that lineage. I'm just saying. Subscribe to the channel if you already haven't. Leave your comments in the comment section. Let's have a discussion on this. See you next time. Stay safe out there.